Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes, so we'll be with you in just a moment. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Hi, everyone. Good to see you back for another webinar in our Nonprofit Finance Fund series on financial management. My name is Michael Ibrahim, and I am Program Manager with the Cultural Investment Portfolio here at the Mass Cultural Council. Our focus in our work is for nonprofit cultural organizations, and so far, we are super excited to be delivering our financial management series, and today we're focusing on understanding full cost. This workshop is part of our Mass Cultural Council Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. We're going through the end of June. We wrap up with all 43 webinars that we have done and are planning to do the rest of the month. And this is towards the end of our financial management series. Joining us today is Ashley Franks from the Nonprofit Finance Fund. We'll get started with Ashley in just a moment, but a few ground rules to get going. If you've been to our webinars and meetings already, you know that we have automatic captioning in all of our digital delivery. Auto-generated captions are provided on all Zoom meetings and webinars here at the Mass Cultural Council. If you need additional accommodations to ensure your participation for future sessions, just let us know when you register and we'll be happy to do that for you. If this is distracting, you can always hide the subtitles by clicking that option in the closed captioning feature at the bottom of Zoom. We're going to have time for questions and answers with Ashley like we do in all of our sessions. We ask you to please use the Q&A function. You do have the ability to be anonymous by using the Q&A function if you don't want to have your name or your organization represented as such. So that's a good place to do that. And we'll make sure that we answer questions as we go along. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Mass Cultural Council's YouTube channel probably tomorrow. You'll get an email from me when that recording is available. This session does run for 1 hour, and that includes time for conversation. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Ashley.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. And again, welcome to our 10th session as part of this MCC Financial Management webinar series. Like Michael said, my name is Ashley Franks, and I'm a senior associate in our advisory services practice at NFF. We're so grateful that you're taking the time with us today to learn more about an important sector-wide challenge, which is how we think about the cost it takes to run a nonprofit successfully to achieve outcomes and how we fund those costs. I invite you all to take care of yourselves throughout the webinar. We'll talk about meeting agreements in a few. I have a puppy who often makes an appearance in the background, and so he might show up. And so let's all just be graceful in this space to one another. And with that, tell you a little bit more about NFF. Many of you have already been with us throughout this webinar series, but the full cost work is really the core of NFF's work, where we seek to help community-centered organizations, especially those led by and serving people of color, control the financial resources they need to achieve the goals they've set for themselves. And we do this work by making loans to nonprofits, by consulting with nonprofits and funders on the use and deployments of funds in the sector, and by working with partners to lift up our on-the-ground learnings with our clients and say, hey, nonprofits, hey, funders, here's something that's not working. Here's how we can make it better. And so our learning goals for today's session are to build shared awareness about the structurally inequitable systems in which we operate. Some of you may have sat through our operating context content where we talk about the flawed system we're all operating within and how we can be successful within that system and advocate for better practices within that system. We'll talk more about that today. We hope to learn how to communicate the full cost of an organization and learn how to think about our organizations with a full cost mindset. And then finally, we want to challenge assumptions about reasonable costs, about accountability, power dynamics, and privilege to advance equity and results. Like Michael mentioned, we have about an hour together today, and here are our room agreements for that hour. Even though this is a webinar format presentation, we still invite you to contribute to a meaningful learning experience. There will be moments where I ask you to share reflections in the chat. You can feel free to do that, or feel free to grapple with the questions I ask internally if for some reason articulating your thoughts in the chat feels uncomfortable. And so to that end, we encourage you to respect each other's experiences. We encourage you to share freely and candidly. We encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature. And of course, like I mentioned just a moment ago, take good care of yourself, whether that be drinking water, stretching, petting your animal beside you, whatever you need, we encourage you to do that. Another really important meeting agreement is that in this space, we accept that structural racism and other forms of oppression are real. That is a fact that we are not arguing against in this space. Equity has come up in our past webinar series, and certainly it will come up a few times throughout the webinar today. And we should all agree that equity is a concern in our sector and in the world at large. And so if these meeting agreements sound all right and everyone in our virtual space is okay with these agreements, can I get a yes in the chat? Just a nice little yes, or just some sort of signal that you all are okay with these agreements. And I'm gonna go ahead and look at the chat. I see a yes from Maureen, yes from Rebecca. All the yeses are coming in. Awesome. Seems that we're all in agreement for how we hope to spend the next hour or so together. Thank you so much, everyone. And so it looks like we have apologies for the text that's across the screen. That's not even really that important. What's important is that we'll be talking about land and property in this space today. And we're also talking about cost composition in the context of racial equity more generally. And so I'd like to begin our time together today with a land acknowledgement. And for those of you in the room who don't know what a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land we're on. We are on violently stolen land, and it is important to commemorate Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land. And so with that, I would like to honor the ancestors from the Native American community by thanking them for allowing us to be guests in this space today and recognize the land on which we reside. I'm personally residing on Lenni Lenape territory. And so I now invite you in the chat to say hello to your colleagues. You can indicate what organization you're joining from and to indicate the native land where you reside. I think that by now, maybe Michael might have linked a map of the nations for your reference in the chat. It's also up here on the screen. It's native-land.ca. And I'm going to be checking the chat. And that is okay, Rebecca, that you hit the raise hand button by mistake. We do not value perfection in this space. Also, clearly indicated by this click add text box across the screen here. It's a really great quote too. Make sure to remove that for the final presentation that you all get. And so yes, Michael has linked the native-land.ca link in the chat. And so you can all just take a moment to look up the land on which you reside, the native land on which you reside. Welcome, Heather, from Martha Vineyards Museum. Nice. Got some answers coming in. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you, Rebecca, for sharing. Welcome, Maureen, Jennifer. Welcome, Lisa. We've got answers coming in. Awesome. Continue to share those in the chat. Thank you, everyone who's participating. I do want to say that we recognize that it is important to go beyond a mere land acknowledgement. And so as you're popping in those answers in the chat and as you journey through the rest of this session, I encourage you to continue to, reflect on the ways in which you or your organization can support and be in relationship with Indigenous communities. And so please do continue to pop those answers into the chat. And I'm going to actually go ahead and have us jump right into the content. So we do have limited time together today. So by now, many of you in the virtual room have sat through at least a few of the webinars in this webinar series. And if you have, you know that in one of our sessions, I talked about it a little bit earlier. We talked about the flawed system in which we operate as a nonprofit sector and why it's so difficult for nonprofits to sustain and grow. And if you haven't sat through the sessions that detail our operating context, I'll share with you what you already know based on your experiences on the ground. It is difficult for nonprofits to generate surpluses because we often operate money-losing businesses. And by that, I mean that we are providing services to folks who can't pay at all or who can't pay the full cost of what it takes to deliver our services. And so we end up relying on subsidies from third-party payers, as you all know, which is an entirely different business to run. We know that subsidy revenues take their own set of capacities. You all know how much work it takes to fundraise, how much work it takes to manage your individual revenue streams, how much work it takes to manage government contracts. That is its own kind of business. We know that and feel that on the ground. And so knowing how hard it is for nonprofit organizations to achieve financial health, we know that aiming to break even is not enough. And so if you leave this webinar with one message today, we hope it is this: that nonprofits need profits. That will be a through line throughout the webinar today. Nonprofit is a tax status, but it is not a business model. Nonprofits need surpluses. And that's because in addition to meeting day-to-day expenses, we need to meet three types of needs, which you can see on the screen. The first is to meet our liquidity needs, which is making sure that our organizations have enough cash on hand to meet our bills day to day, week to week, month to month, to keep operations moving smoothly, even when the timing for cash coming in and cash going out doesn't match up. Second is adaptability, which means that we have flexible resources that will allow us to grow, change, make adjustments, and respond to changing community needs. I think we all know and feel that COVID has really been a universal example of how quickly we might need to adapt to changes and why dollars for adaptability are so important. And then finally, we need dollars for durability, of course, in different amounts depending on our organization and our goals. And these are the resources that we really think about supporting the organization in the very long term. And so we think about buildings living here. We think about investment reserves and things like that. Durability may be very important for organizations like museums, universities, hospitals, housing organizations, right? And then durability might be less important for organizations who are, say, focused on advocacy or whose programs require a lot of travel. For these organizations, adaptability might be more important. And so now I'm going to go ahead and introduce the full cost framework. And before we dive into the actual components of the framework, I first want to say that when NFF uses the language full cost, we mean something very specific. We know that there are lots of ways that this language is described in the field. Some people call it real cost, some people call it true cost, some people call it total cost. You all have probably heard this language in one way or another. And it's really easy to get conflated because often as a sector, when we use this language, we are talking about just program versus overhead or direct costs versus indirect costs. And these are certainly important things to talk about, right? It is super important that we demystify the segregated nature of these costs as we think about the fullness of our day-to-day needs. But at NFF, when we say full cost, we mean something much, much more. Because when we limit ourselves to talking about just program versus overhead and just direct versus indirect, it is as if we have a financial advisor who comes to us and says, hey guys, I have the perfect recipe to set your family up for success. And it goes like this. Ready? Take every paycheck you ever earn and spend it down to zero every month. Make sure that by the end of the year, every year, you have nothing left over in your bank account. That is financial success. Voila, go on your way. Of course, we know that that is not true. We know that we need savings in case of an emergency. We might also have plans in the future that we want to save for, like a business investment, a wedding, or we may want to buy property. There are a lot of different reasons why we need to put money aside and why we wouldn't want to spend our paycheck down to zero every month. But in the nonprofit world, we've been so underfunded that a lot of our conversations are about, can I just get my full paycheck once a month, even if I spend it down to zero? I just need the full paycheck. And full cost is asking that we take a step beyond that and that we think about the entirety of our needs. Because the reality is that if we as a sector just spend all of our energy saying, I just need to get my full direct or overhead costs covered, we become a sector that can't pay its bills on time, a sector that can't respond to or adapt to changing community needs, and a sector that struggles to survive when a crisis or unexpected storm hits. And so full cost takes all of this into account. So we think this is a better way to talk about costs in the nonprofit sector. Full cost names and claims all of the financial resources that it takes to run an effective organization for the long haul. It lifts the sector out of this false dichotomy of program versus overhead, direct versus indirect. It captures short-term and long-term needs, which we'll talk about when we dive into the components of the framework. And we also see this as a tool for advancing racial equity, because full cost allows us to ground the conversation about cost in context. And that context includes present and historical practices of extracting wealth from Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color, often stealing that wealth violently to enrich white communities, right? So when we look at the cost composition of an organization and the community in which it's grounded, full cost takes into account that historical context of who has had resources and who hasn't, who has been enriched and who's been stolen from. It allows for all of that nuance. And so now I'm actually going to dive into the 6 components that we see making up the full cost framework. And you turn your attention to the screen here, you can see that we have this pie graphic here representing each of those 6 components. And so we look at them as slices of a pie. And as we're moving through each component, I want you to think of these slices not as equal slices in a pie, but as seats at a table, voices in a conversation that are asking you to consider them when you're thinking about the full cost of your organization. And so the first slice of our pie is total expenses. And these are both our operating and non-operating expenses. Our operating expenses are regular and recurring expenses, those things that will always come up, like our utilities, which includes our light bill and our internet, of course, our people costs, things like that. Those are regular recurring expenses. And then our non-operating expenses are more irregular in nature. They may be extraordinary one-time expenses that we don't anticipate incurring on an ongoing basis. This might look like a year, and this is going to be an extreme example, but this might look like a year where, God forbid, we get hit with a really big lawsuit and we have a lot of legal fees to pay. If we don't regularly get sued, we probably won't incur these kind of legal fees on a normal basis, maybe never again. And so both operating and non-operating expenses fall under the total expenses category. And then of course, we also have our direct and indirect expenses included here. We have program and overhead expenses included here, and depreciation expense is here. We also have something called unfunded expenses, which you can see has an asterisk here, which we'll talk more about in a moment. What total expenses does not include are any purchases that are capitalized. So if you're buying a building or purchasing an expensive piece of equipment, anything that's going to be put on the balance sheet, that purchase does not show up here. That's going to go in another slice of full cost, which we'll cover later. And then also repaying debt principal does not show up in total expenses. That's also another slice of the full cost pie. But the interest you pay on your debt would show up in total expenses. So to simplify this, you can think of total expenses as anything that shows up on your income statement or your profit and loss statement. But I did say that we were going to come back to unfunded expenses, which is really important. And so let's dive in a little bit deeper there. So unfunded expenses are interesting because this is something that doesn't show up on any of our financial statements. And that's because these are expenses that are not currently being incurred, but that if they were covered would allow our organizations to work in a way that is more reasonable and fair. So one example of an unfunded expense is sweat equity, probably one of the most common unfunded expenses. And sweat equity is when you have folks overworking and being underpaid. And that probably sounds familiar. Let's say that we have an executive director who is working 60 hours a week. Already you're probably thinking, that's a lot, and that's also unfair, but it's also not uncommon. Maybe that's some of your experiences here in this virtual room. If that ED were to reduce her hours to the standard 40 hours a week and hire an assistant to help out the other 20 hours a week, that would probably be a lot more workable, right? And so the cost for an assistant for 20 hours a week that the ED is currently spending in extra labor, unpaid labor, is an unfunded expense. That's because if this expense were actually being incurred, it would allow the ED to work in a way that is reasonable and fair. And of course, it would also affect the operations of the organization because the ED now has more time to focus on the things that are vital to their position. Not that they weren't focused on those things when they were working the 60 hours a week, likely why they were working so much, but you all know how muddled time can get when you're spending so much of it on a bunch of different things. So what unfunded expenses are not are expenses to expand or do more. The example we just went over does not assume that if the assistant were hired, that the ED would continue to work 60 hours a week to push out even more, or that the ED would only take her hours down to 50 instead of 60. The idea is that this unfunded expense brings us to, again, a fair and reasonable place, equilibrium, if you will. And sweat equity is just one example. Some other examples of unfunded expenses are subpar supplies, slow internet, and unfilled positions, things that, if we covered these expenses, they would make our organizations operate a lot more successfully. In general, in the nonprofit world, we have gotten really used to dealing with less, and we've accepted these gaps in our funding system. And so we create these really creative runarounds and workarounds to make things work. And we've stopped even asking the question, what do we really need to be doing our work in a fair and reasonable way? And the full cost framework asks us to reorient our thinking to consider what it is we truly need. And so actually, I'm just going to stop there and take a temperature check. Is this resonating with any of your experiences on the ground? Does your organization have any unfunded expenses that kind of keep you awake at night, or that you feel like stifle the successful operations of the organization? Feel free to share those reflections in the chat. And also, do you feel like you're including all of your expenses in your budget at present? Would love to hear some reflections from you all about how this is resonating, or whether it's resonating. I see that some folks have unpaid interns, unfilled positions. These are all common. These are all absolutely common. We definitely have many unfunded expenses. We had a volunteer do a part-time job. And that's all too common, and especially in the human services and arts fields. What about needs that aren't currently met by the staffing model, like having a head of operations for a building, work that can only happen if we have volunteers? That is a great point. And actually, I think that we'll talk more about that in a moment. Employees using their own electronics. These are all examples of unfunded expenses. Sweat equity is definitely a big one. Over 2,000 volunteer hours a year. And this is something that we actually talk about at NFF, is that we don't see a problem with volunteerism. We know that volunteers do great work and are vital to the missions of so many organizations, but what we don't want to see is forced volunteerism, because organizations can't afford to pay their people, right? And that's kind of what I'm seeing come through in the chat. Definitely sweat equity, deferred maintenance. Staff who have foregone raises to help the bottom line. All of these things are unfunded expenses. And even that we're getting to the place of thinking about the fullness of these needs is exactly what the full cost framework encourages. Thank you all for sharing those reflections. So after total expenses, which we think of as existing on our income statement, except for unfunded expenses, we all just kind of shared in the chat that those are things that really just live on our hearts and in our minds. And we hope to change that. I hope that, by the end of today's session, you all can have conversations about how you can maybe add some of those unfunded expenses into your budget, knowing that it is not that simple. But after total expenses, all of the other components of full costs, we think of as being balance sheet needs. So when we say that nonprofits need profits, that nonprofits need surpluses, these next 5 slices that we'll cover will show us why. Because they only get covered by way of revenue exceeding expenses at the end of the year. And so the second slice is working capital. And this is dollars to cover, predictable ebbs and flows of cash coming in and cash coming out of our organization, even when they may not be aligned. Working capital really allows us to maintain business operations, even if money is late coming in or if bills must be paid early. This is often an issue that government-reliant organizations see, where contracts may be late to pay, where services were already delivered. And for those organizations, it's really important to have an internal line of credit to draw on to keep operations running, even when those contracts are late to pay. So this money, working capital, is accessible to management and is usually in a checking account. It is not restricted and it is not strictly designated either. We think of working capital as being needed by all organizations all the time, but certainly the amount varies from organization to organization. It really just depends on your particular cash flow situation. If you are an organization where the timing of dollars coming in and dollars coming out is very nicely aligned month after month, that is fantastic. And maybe 1 month of working capital is very comfortable for you. That's a comfortable amount. For other organizations, like I just mentioned, especially government-reliant organizations, cash flow may ebb for 6 months or even 12 months. And if you don't have access to 6 or 12 months of cash to continue operations while you're waiting on that money, you're not going to make it through the year, right? So it really just varies between organizations. What working capital is not is dollars to cover lost revenue, unplanned expenses, or deficits. Those things fall under our next slice, which is reserves. And just one moment, I'm gonna take this toy from my puppy because it's so loud. 1 second. Real life happening in the background here. So Now we're on reserves, which is different from working capital, and I'll explain that difference in a moment. Reserves are dollars used for a specific purpose that are eventually replenished. Reserves are typically board designated, and some examples of designations are operating reserves. So this is money that is intended to protect from risk by covering short-term deficits. So let's say you have a bad fundraising year, or a global pandemic hits. You want to be able to draw from your reserves to cover losses. Fixed asset reserves is another designation. This is where you save for the repair or eventual replacement of your equipment, or for improvements to your property if you own any. And then you can have an R&D reserve, which is a research and development reserve, to allow us to take artistic risks. And how many of us get to do that, right? A lot of this may seem aspirational, but it is the goal. And then there are investment reserves, which is another type of reserve that we might see. Usually there is a big pot of dollars that gets invested, and the intention is that they generate revenue for the organization. Certainly, every type of organization doesn't need every type of reserve designation we just listed. Maybe for sure operating reserves, definitely for sure operating reserves. But we do believe that all organization needs reserves in general. The purpose and size of those reserves will vary by organization. For example, a fixed asset reserve may not make sense for an organization that doesn't own property or equipment. And so it really just depends. Reserves should be accessible to management under certain conditions, namely with board approval that it is in fact time to dip into reserves. And reserves may be held in savings account or in investments that can be liquidated. And so now I'm going to kind of get into the difference between working capital and reserves, because some folks ask, like, what is the difference? Why are they two different slices of the full cost pie? They're both cash on the balance sheet, right? And the people who ask those questions are right. Yes, they're both cash on the balance sheet, but they operate very differently. Working capital is meant to be accessed day to day, week to week, month to month. That balance is constantly going up and down and up and down. Whereas reserves are typically built up over time, usually years, and then a time or a purpose comes to spend down the reserves. And that's usually a moment for an organization, a big moment. COVID is an example of that for many organizations who had saved for years and years and years, and then experienced a sudden loss of income for months or a year and had to spend down reserves. And so generally with reserves, after you spend down, you stabilize again over time, and then you begin to replenish again that reserve pool over the years. Whereas it's understood with working capital that balance will be going up and down, up and down. So I hope that distinction is clear. The next slice of the full cost pie is debt principal repayment. And that is dollars to pay off debt. It may sound obvious that if you borrow money, you have to make a plan to pay it back. But we name this as a piece of the full cost pie because paying back the principal balance on a loan is a balance sheet transaction. So again, when we say that nonprofits need profits, this is why. Debt principal is paid out of those surpluses. It is paid out of revenue being larger than expenses at the end of the year. Debt may show up in the form of a line of credit, mortgage on property, loans from board members, and other forms of borrowing. Then the fifth slice of our full cost pie is fixed asset additions. And this is the purchase of new equipment, buildings, furniture, land, leaseholder improvements, etc. Fixed asset additions are not replacement or simple maintenance of existing fixed assets. We account for that in depreciation, which is under total expenses, if you remember that. We might save for improvement of these assets in a fixed asset reserve, which we just covered. But this slice of the pie is particularly for the addition of new fixed assets. This is also, of course, not for small equipment purchases that are not going to be capitalized, that are not going to be put on the balance sheet. And then we have our final slice of the pie, and that is change capital. And change capital can be a transformative investment and a vehicle for advancing equity. And so we're going to actually dive quite deep into this concept. I'm going to ask that you hold questions about change capital until the end, because it is possible that it will just make more sense to you as I'm progressing through the content. And I will make sure that I pause for questions and reflections at the end of this section. So what exactly is change capital? Periodically, organizations must make significant shifts in their business model to align with changing community needs and other marketplace realities. These shifts can include, but are not limited to, say, improving or reconfiguring programs and operations, investing in R&D, downsizing, merging, and investing in new or under-resourced revenue streams, because maybe the revenue streams we have just aren't working anymore and we need a refresh. In order to execute these kinds of business model changes, these business model shifts, usually organizations require an investment that is implemented over a period of several years. And this investment is change capital. Typically, change capital is quite large. It's often double or even 3 times the size of an organization's annual operating budget. When we think about how difficult it is to break even in our sector, given the flawed system that we're operating within, I keep alluding to that, we know that generating consistent surpluses is even harder. And so change capital is not usually a self-investment. It doesn't usually come from internal organic growth. It usually comes from an external capital infusion, an external investment from trusted foundation partners, or from an individual donor. Calculating the hard costs that you need to change your business model is something that you would work on with consultants like ourselves at NFF in greater detail to determine, what kinds of expenses will actually be incurred or what will actually change as a result of your proposed changes. And then what revenue will be needed to support those expense changes. And so if we look at this last box here in our graphic, when considering the cost of your business model change, you want to start with defining the cost of your inputs involved in your business model shift, such as those one-time upfront expenses like research and development, like new equipment, like marketing. You also want to consider other inputs like new capacity, what new positions need to be filled. Some of you mentioned just a moment ago that there are like unfilled positions. You need more capacity to deliver on your mission. There are also going to be ongoing facility and equipment maintenance costs. And then of course, there are the direct costs of the change. The theory of change capital is that such targeted investments will help generate year-over-year surpluses that cover the full cost of doing business. 2 important goals to consider when thinking through your proposed change are, first, how to create a more resilient business model in the face of sector-wide changes, right? Amid COVID and a host of other changes that we're constantly dealing with in our sector. And then second, how to cover upfront costs of change and deficits until your new business model revenue exceeds expenses. Another way to kind of contextualize this is if you think of your organization as being in the startup phase again, at the beginning of a change capital infusion. We know that startups often spend more than they make in the beginning until their investment eventually produces a return that covers the startup costs, and that also covers the ongoing costs associated with the business model change that makes the business sustainable in the long run. And again, some of this will make more sense as we're progressing through the content. So now you understand the theory of what change capital is and what goals you should consider when shifting your business model. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about when change capital is helpful. And so just to orient you to this slide, we have time along the bottom and dollars along the left. We have expenses represented by this red line here on the graph, and then we have our business model revenue represented by this green line. And like I mentioned a moment ago, what we typically see when an organization launches a new line of business or expands on an existing line of business is the need for an upfront investment like change capital. I mean, just imagine having all of these brilliant ideas about how to change, but no funding to pursue these ideas. And that's probably the case for some of you in the room today. Let's say one day you get the funding to invest in the change you want to see. A funder comes to you and says, hey, here's $1 million to invest in business model change. You want to expand your programming, you want to bolster your individual giving program. Here's money to do it. That would be so exciting, right? And so let's talk about what that would look like. So where we start before the funder comes to us with that external investment is here at business as usual. We have the former business model in need of change. That's where we start. And then, that's where we're starting. And we're going to launch our business model repositioning soon, right? And so like a startup, our expenses exceed our revenue for a period of time, as you can see, until our ordinary revenue catches up or until our investment produces a return or a surplus. The time period of fully funding our new operation often takes between 3 to 5 years. It is that long. And so some of our new expenses will be one-time investments, but many will continue to be ongoing costs, such as new or increased staff salaries and maintenance of new tech systems. And so change capital will cover the deficits that we produce until our operations are fully funded by our ongoing revenue. And that's when we get here. This is the goal, right? We want to get to a place where our revenue outpaces the growth in expenses that we incurred from shifting our business model so that we're generating those year-over-year surpluses that cover the full cost of doing business. Before we proceed with a more illustrative example of how change capital is intended to support business model shift, we want to make sure that we first distinguish between the two types of money your organization will need to balance during a change capital infusion. And these two types of money are buy dollars and build dollars, which we can think of as ice cream. You can see little ice cream cones here. They're both great. They're both delicious. We want them both. We need them both to make a great sundae, but they are two different flavors. And so buy dollars on the left here are your reliable and repeatable revenue sources. These are dollars that we'll need every single year to cover our operating costs, including our services, programs, and overhead. Nonprofit organizations will always need buy dollars to operate from year to year. We need funders who will say, hey, I want to fund XYZ mission. Your work is in service of that mission. Here's some funding to continue what you're already doing. And then we want them to come back next year and do the same thing. And then the next year and the next year and the next, right? These funders are regular buyers of our existing services. Emphasis on our existing services. We will always need them. Build dollars here on the right are different. They pay for extraordinary needs and are episodic in nature. Build dollars are not intended to replace repeatable and reliable forms of revenue. Build dollars can serve many purposes, but like I just mentioned, we most often see them used to invest in some sort of change for an organization and not in what the organization is already doing. And so that may mean investing in an organization doing more, doing less, or just operating more efficiently. Because change capital is a temporary investment of build dollars, once change capital funds are spent, the hope is that buy revenue, right, that regular repeatable revenue will be enough to cover costs and produce surpluses, which can then be saved and used to support the organization in the future. And so let's look at a successful implementation of change capital. This graph is a visualization, of how change capital is intended to support business model change. And so again, we have time along the horizontal axis, and we can see that it took this particular organization 5 years to fully implement their change. We have our ordinary revenue in purple, and we have our change capital in yellow. And with this graph, organization A starts its journey with modest revenue. You can see that here. It's mostly change capital. And then they decided to hire a new development director with the change capital funds in hopes of bringing in new foundation revenue to expand its programming. And already by year 2, we can see that organization A is seeing a return on its investment in the form of foundation funding. And so now there's more ordinary revenue and the change capital is being spent down. However, they figure out in year 2, in order to manage the inflow of grants, they must now update their accounting software, meaning they have to spend more of the change capital. Again, that change capital is being spent down. And then in subsequent years, more revenue continues to come in because the organization is now figuring out how to manage the grant program more efficiently. Their development director is on fire, bringing in ongoing funding. And then we can see by 2023, which is year 5 of their change, organization A has fully spent down their change capital funding and replaced it with ordinary revenue. By this process, organization A is able to sustain their new business model with funds it otherwise would not have been able to provide in those initial years if they didn't have that change capital infusion. This is an example of a successful use of change capital. This is an example of what we might see when change capital is misapplied. To emphasize the point that has kind of been a through line throughout this section, change capital is meant to ensure that an organization emerges from a planned period of extraordinary investment more financially stable and resilient. It is not, however, intended to be a substitute for regular earned or contributed revenue. It's not supposed to be a substitute for buy revenue. We don't want to see reliance on change capital as buy revenue because change capital funds are eventually depleted, unlike buy revenue, which, under ideal circumstances, you continue to get those. Those are ongoing. Repeated reliance on change capital funds results in organizational shock when the funds are depleted. And we sometimes call this the rubber band effect. And that's when an organization gets a capital infusion. It grows to be 2 or 3 times its original size. So it stretches and stretches and stretches. But when it can't sustain that growth because it didn't invest in those buy revenue streams, those regular repeatable revenue streams, it's like you let the rubber band go and the organization contracts to its original size, or sometimes even smaller. And so what we're seeing on this graph, where organization B applies change capital in this straight line manner over multiple years, is considered misapplied. And that's because once these yellow funds on the graph are depleted, and they will be depleted, change capital is not endless, revenue may not be able to cover the new costs associated with their new business model. And this organization may have to be bailed out. And so we want to make sure that we're spending down change capital in such a way that produces a return in the form of a sustainable and repeatable, or several sustainable and repeatable ordinary revenue streams. This is a successful deployment of change capital funds. We emphasize this distinction so much because it's really important to know what kind of money you need as a nonprofit. And it's important for funders to know what kind of money they're giving and what rights they have based on the kind of money they're giving, which we'll talk about in the next slide. These kinds of dollars are not distinguished in financial statements in our sector. They are in the for-profit sector. So it's important that we know the difference, right? Lack of clarity about whether an organization needs or is receiving billed versus buy dollars creates confusion. It creates unrealistic expectations, and it is frustrating for both nonprofits and funders. When a nonprofit is able to say, hey, funder, this is the kind of money I need, and when, and the funder knows their rights attached to the kind of money they're giving, that really sets the partnership up for greater success. And so just quickly, before I get some reflections from you all, funders are entitled to different rights based on the kind of funding they're providing. If a funder is a buyer of the services an organization already produces, meaning they're not paying for change or transformation, they're entitled to budgets for the years they're funding only. They're entitled to standard reports that the organization is already producing for the years they're funding only. We don't want to see a funder ask a nonprofit for new reports that may require additional technology and staff time that the funder is not paying for, right? The funder should only be asking for data and evidence for program success that the organization is already collecting. They are a buyer of this organization's ongoing services. If a funder is a builder, meaning they're funding an organization to build something new or transformative, their rights are different. However, those rights are still agreed to and negotiated with the nonprofit upfront. A buyer may be entitled to ask for multi-year budgets and projections that go beyond the term of the grant, which is fair. They want to make sure that the organization will be able to sustain beyond the grant period, especially if there's an infusion of $1 million or so. The funder might ask for strategic plans beyond the term of the grant for those same reasons. They may ask for cash flow projections and discussion about more than what the organization does, because they're paying for more than what the organization already does. That is all fair. What we don't want to see is a buyer claiming builder rights. And I'm sure many of you in the room have experienced a muddled partnership in this way, which is why it's important to know the difference. So that was a lot of exposition on my end. And I do want to make sure we take at least like 2 to 3 minutes for reflections. I invite you to share in the chat some reflections, or again, this can just be food for thought to chew on internally. I recognize that change capital may be a very new concept to some of you, and you may not have any immediate questions or reflections, but if you do, how does the concept of change capital resonate with you? Have you seen the conflation of build and buy money, and what challenges, has that created? And then how, if you have the brain space to grapple with the third question, how might change capital be a vehicle for advancing equity? And I'll be monitoring the chat for some, and it doesn't look like we have any questions in the Q&A, right, Michael?
That's correct.
Awesome. So yeah, feel free to reflect, but also, that reflection can be totally internal. And I'll wait like 30 seconds or so to see if anything comes through in the chat. Change capital, it's complex, certainly, but also so transformative. I have a client who is currently applying for a change capital. They recognize that, their current revenue streams weren't necessarily the most conducive to their mission impact. They realize foundation funding is not the most reliable for their organization. It's too restrictive. And so they wanted to bolster their individual giving program, which meant that they needed to make several new hires, hire a major gifts officer, hire a development coordinator. They needed new systems. They needed like wealth analysis engines, all these things that would allow them to bring in more individual giving dollars. And so they're up for about $1 million from a foundation right now to invest in this change. And it's been quite a process figuring out what the change will look like, what the investments will be. It's really exciting though. How would change capital be illustrated on a financial statement in the annual report? And I'm going to assume that you mean like the P&L, the income statement. Change capital would be pulled below the line as a non-operating expense, and it would show up as just that, change capital. Investing in development staff can take many years to recoup. You are absolutely correct. And that's why we often recommend that an investment such as that be given 3 to 5 years, or sometimes even longer. We understand that even hiring the development staff you need is not as straightforward as it might seem on the front end. It may take a while to get a body in the seat, and then to have them do the work it takes to bring in more money. Any other questions? I'm going to do like that 7-second countdown before I move on. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure that I wrap us up nicely here today. See one more. A challenge in the chat. Some challenges from conflating build and buy money. In a small nonprofit, the mere act of spending the build money can take a position away from raising buy money. Learning outcome, need to staff for build as well as buy funding. Exactly. Exactly. The two coexisting is the best way. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to move us along in the interest of time. Congratulations, we've now gone over the full cost pie in its entirety. And those 6 slices might seem like a lot. I wish we had more time to grapple with change capital too, because I know there's so much there. But as our time together comes to an end, I do want to offer that not every slice of the full cost pie is needed by all organizations all the time. Remember, this framework is about these 6 slices being a voice at the table. If you remember that metaphor I shared at the beginning, they're asking to be considered. This is about us as a sector moving away from hand to mouth thinking. So even if you get to a place where you're starting to think about adding in your unfunded expenses, where you're starting to think about your facility costs, all of those things, that's a great place to be. And I'm already starting to glean from the chat that folks are beginning to think about the fullness of their needs. You've already been thinking about these things, but maybe now you have the language to bring back to your organizations. And so I just quickly want to go over how we think about prioritizing full costs at NFF before we close out. Total expenses, working capital, and reserves are needed by all organizations all the time. While the remaining 3 slices, debt repayment, fixed asset additions, and change capital are needed by some organizations some of the time. Your organization may not have debt, or you may not own a building. So these full cost considerations are really just on a case-by-case basis. And certainly your full cost needs might change over time. You may not own a building now, but you may want to own one in the future, right? And because needs change over time, we wouldn't expect organizations to meet their full cost needs right away. We know that financial strength in our sector is often built slowly over decades, but certainly funders can help speed that up by giving large and flexible grants, particularly to organizations working in communities that have been systemically denied the opportunity to build financial wealth. And that leads me to my final point here, which is that full cost funding is a two-way street. You know, both nonprofits and funders have a role to play in advancing full cost thinking and funding. We know that the roles are not even by any means. I do not want to suggest that, but there are 2 players at the table, right? For the nonprofits, it's important to know your full costs. Funders cannot pay for costs that are not clear. You have to be able to communicate the full cost of your organization. And you have to be able to ask for the right money and know when you need it. And of course, you have to be able to be accountable to your community and your mission. And then for funders, it's important to create the conditions for open and honest dialogue, to ask questions to understand an organization's full cost and to match the funding type to the organization's needs. We are all on the same team to maximize mission impact for the communities we serve. With that, there are some takeaway slides here that they're advice for nonprofits and funders to transform the conversation. You can look at these on your own. There is a full cost resource page at the end of the deck where you can go on our website to learn more about full cost. There's a conversation guide. There's a full cost workbook. You can calculate your unfunded expenses in the workbook and calculate other full cost needs there. And so hopefully take advantage of that. And with that, that is the end of our time together. Thank you so much for your attentiveness throughout the past hour. I know that was a lot of information, and certainly you may need time to chew on it beyond this hour. I do hope, though, that you're all leaving here as like full cost warriors in training. Just as a reminder, we do have our next webinar on June 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on partnership and collaborations led by Christine Alvarez. And we hope to see you there. If you have like 1 more minute, I'm going to pass the mic to Michael, who's going to officially close us out. Thank you so much.
Awesome, Ashley. And you know, the best thing that I liked about that slide when it comes to nonprofit and funder responsibilities is that the funder has more responsibilities. That's really important. There's an extra bullet there that should be doing more work on that. So thank you. Ashley, this has been amazing. And for everyone that's here, you're going to get this presentation, obviously in the Dropbox, but also the video to share it around, because I think this is a couple watches. This is a couple times to go through this to really be able to quantify that. And we'll be sharing around that workbook. And I think folks really love tools to be able to calculate that. In addition to the session that Ashley talked about next week, which is with NFF, we actually have one this Thursday. Some of you may remember Sandy McKinley, who did some of our Safe Harbors webinars and some of our other work with us. She's back on Thursday to do a session about looking at your life cycle. So we have organizations that are maybe in the startup mode or mature, or maybe in decline, or any combination of where they exist in their own life cycle and how that informs their planning on top of this. So that's this Thursday at 2 o'clock with Sandy, if you want to attend that. But otherwise, and we'll be recording that as well. But otherwise, thank you, Ashley. This has been truly, truly helpful and phenomenal. I know a lot of folks are really going to get a lot of goodness out of this one. So thank you for that. Thank you for everyone to attending today, and stay safe, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.